Welcome to the Conch Economist. I'm Merle Dimbath, and I'll be sharing with you insights and explanations about current economic issues and problems. I want to help you become your own economist. Our goal is to survive the waves of economic change by making better decisions and choices in the ordinary business of life. Well, today we're going to look again at the problem of affordability in housing, specifically a new proposal by the president for a possible 50-year mortgage. Let's examine that. There are pros and cons to that proposal, just like there would be to a lot of other ideas. But this one might be able to help some people. On an encouraging note, interest rates have been coming down on 30-year fixed mortgages. I've got a couple of charts here that I'll display on the screen. We can see that in January of this year, the rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage was a little over 7%, specifically just 7.04%. Since that time, not necessarily in a straight line fashion, we don't draw straight lines in economics, but the mortgage rates have been coming down and recently reached a low point for the year so far here at the end of October 30th, at 6.17%. So there has been some improvement, and there is an indication that the Fed is not finished with a policy of reducing interest rates. We anticipate that to continue into next year. It may not happen in December, but clearly, with a new Federal Reserve chairman scheduled to be appointed in May, the interest rate policy will continue, apparently, from what we can tell, to be lower. So interest rates have been coming down, but they're still too high for some people to be able to afford a home, particularly those who are trying to buy a home for the first time. So let's take a look at the good side and bad side of the proposed 50-year mortgage and see if this might be something that could help people. All right, let's start out assuming that you're purchasing a house, would like to purchase a house for $375,000. You put a 20% down payment, and so your loan is going to be $300,000. Now, as we indicated a moment ago, interest rates are getting close to 6%. They're not there yet, but let's be optimistic and assume that another 2 or 3 months we can get a 30-year fixed rate loan at 6%. Our monthly payment would be $1,798. And assuming a 30-year mortgage, that would be 360 payments, which over the lifetime of the loan, if you held the loan for the entire period of time, total payments would be $647,280. And subtracting the amount of the original loan, your interest is $347,282. You're actually going to be paying more interest than you do in principal. Now, let's assume that you get a 50-year loan, and let's assume for the sake of discussion right now, you can get it at 6%. What would that do to the monthly payment? Well, that would lower the monthly payment by a little over $200, down to $1,579. That might be enough to get you qualified. Maybe you couldn't qualify at $1,798 a month, but a little bit lower, you might be able to qualify here at $1,579. Of course, over 5 years, or excuse me, over 50 years, the total payments would be $600. Total payments would now amount to a dollar amount $947,400, which would yield a total interest cost of $647,400. So no doubt about it, the 50-year loan would lower your monthly payment, but over the lifetime of the loan, you are doubling the amount of interest that you're going to pay, even though the interest rate is the same percent, 6% here. Because of the additional 20 years, we would be at $647,000 interest payment. Question: how much would interest rates have to fall in order for you to get the advantage of the 50-year loan, assuming 6%, but only pay it over 30 years? Well, I did some calculations on that, and a 30-year fixed rate loan at about 4.8% would give you a monthly payment pretty close to what the 50-year loan would be, 1574 as opposed to, $15.79, $5 a month difference. So for all practical purposes, if interest rates could fall to 4.8%, you would have the advantage of the 1574 monthly payment, but the lifetime of the loan of 360 payments, total payments would be 566, would lower the interest to 266. At least now you're paying less in interest than you are into the total principal. So this would seem to indicate that, okay, it might make sense to go ahead and get into the home at 1579, but later on you might be able to refinance because that's always a possibility. However, there is another issue, and that is what happens if the 50-year loans aren't at 60%? What if the 50-year loans are at a higher rate of interest? Generally speaking, the further out we go, the higher the rate of interest. And we can get some idea of that by looking at the rate of return available on 15-year loans versus 30-year loans. And I've got a chart for that. And so let's take a look at that. Well, as the chart shows, there is a difference between the 15-year fixed rate loan and the 30-year fixed rate loan. A recent comparison on these two showed that the 30-year loan had 6.22%, a little bit higher than one of the rates that we had shown earlier. But bear in mind, mortgage rates can change by the week, sometimes even by the day. Whereas the 15-year loan, 5.5%. So there's a 0.7% difference between a 15-year loan and a 30-year loan. In other words, in the language of the bond market or the interest rate market, we would say that there was 70 basis points difference, specifically 72 basis points difference. So if there's going to be a difference in 15 years there between 15 and 30, I think it's reasonable to assume that if we went from a 30-year mortgage to a 50-year mortgage, there would be a very good chance that the 50-year mortgage would have a higher rate of interest. Let's assume, for the sake of our discussion, that the difference now between the 15 and the 30 would give us guidance here. So let's assume that the 50-year loan would have an interest rate that would be 0.7 percentage points higher than the 30-year loan. Let's take a look and see what the numbers would be on that. Okay, this chart is very much like the last one, except I've added a fourth line here, a 50-year loan at 6.7%. Now, earlier we looked at the 50-year loan at 6%. But as we saw, between a 15 and 30-year loan, there was about 0.7% difference. So let's assume that same kind of differential. On a 50-year loan at 6.7%, our monthly payment would now be $17.36, almost as high as we had before here. Well, $60 shy of where we were with a 30-year at 6%. And now with 600 payments, we've got over $1 million here in total payments, $1,041,000, and total interest here of $741,857. So our advantage here in a 50-year loan, if indeed there is going to be a higher interest rate, is not going to be as great as we thought earlier. For a 50-year at 6%, we were at 1579. Now we're back up to almost where we were before with a 30-year at 6%. So it depends really upon what is the interest rate going to be. The 50-year loan can spread out payments, but that advantage can be wiped out largely by a differential in interest rates if the long-term rate does go up, particularly in reference to how the 30-year mortgage is doing. Now, I would like to leave on a positive note. It's very unlikely that you would stay in the house for 50 years. particularly if you're a first-time home buyer, you may not be in that house for more than 2 or 3 years. And I'm a good example of that. I bought my very first house when I was 26, and a couple of years later, got a higher paying job in another town, and so the house was sold, and off we went. And very often, as all of you know, to move up, you sometimes have to move out. So the thought that you're going to have to stay in that house for 50 years or 30 years, that's very unlikely. People don't stay in houses that long, at least not in the United States, not historic, not in recent times. You're going to move, and chances are you're not going to be in the house for even 10 years. Uh, Data show that people move around sometimes in their younger years more frequently than that. Bottom line, when the time comes and if 50-year mortgages are available, and if that does give you a monthly cost advantage so that you can qualify for the loan, my advice would be to take it, because you can always refinance, and chances are you're not going to stay in the house for 50 years. You may not even stay in the house for 5 years. But the important thing is to go ahead and get started with home ownership and building up equity in real estate, because that is one of the best ways to achieve some net worth and wealth. And the sooner you can get started on that, the better. Also, there's an advantage of a mortgage over rent. Rent is not tax deductible, but the interest on a mortgage is. Plus, when you are a homeowner, there's the advantage of the real estate taxes. If there's real estate taxes on the property, and there almost certainly would be, that is also an item for listing on your personal income tax, whereas you don't get that advantage when you are renting. So, our legal system has put together some very definite advantages for home ownership over renting, even if you're having to pay a high interest rate. The interest rate can be somewhat mitigated because of the tax advantages, and of course, being an owner, you would have now the opportunity to enjoy any appreciation in value. So, um, if the time comes that there is an advantage to you, if you can't get into a home with a 30-year mortgage, but you can get into the home with a 50-year mortgage, my advice is take it, get going, buy your first home, and start achieving some type of equity build up, even if it's modest. At least every month you're making some small payment toward principal, and you are achieving some appreciation and value over a period of time. Well, this concludes my report to you for now. Please share this with others, and don't forget to subscribe. Join the Conch Economist next time for more Surviving the Waves of Economic Change.